what I want to do is direct you to the video that I've already created, showing you how to make the circle skirt pattern, and it's pretty much the same technique. The difference is that I used the half option versus the full option when getting my radius on the circle skirt calculator. And you want to use a half option for this tutorial because it requires you to have pretty much two pieces for your skirt versus one full circle skirt. You want to have a front and a back piece because you will be putting pockets into your skirt. So that's why this time around I used the half option to create my circle skirt pattern. So alright, so here I have my completed half circle skirt pattern, and now what I'm going to do is go ahead and cut it out along the waist, the two sides, and the hem of the skirt. Alright, so here is the completed half circle skirt pattern. Now what we're going to do is add the pocket guide marks, pretty much the marks on your pattern to clip when you're ready to cut, so you can know where to place your pockets when they're ready to be sewn onto your skirt. So what I want you to do is on both sides, this is a side of the skirt and this is a side of the skirt, and from both sides on that side line I want you to measure your waist to hip measurement. Mark your waist to hip measurement. Alright, so I've marked my waist to hip measurement, and after marking my waist to hip measurement on both sides, I found the center of that line and I made a mark on the center of that line. Now for right now we're going to leave the circle skirt pattern where it is and work on our pocket pattern, so we can use our pocket pattern to finish off the placement of marks on our circle skirt to help us when it's time to sew our pocket onto our skirt. So let's go ahead and get to the pocket. For our pocket, we're going to start off by laying our hand completely closed on a new piece of pattern paper. As you can see here, I have my hand here and I want you to lay it exactly as shown on the picture. Lay it on your pattern paper exactly like this, and we're going to create 4 different points using our hand, and then from there we're going to create our pocket pattern. So I want you to place a point at the tip of that middle finger, the longest finger on your hand. Some people's middle finger is not the longest finger, so make sure you are placing the point at the tip of the longest finger on your hand, and then place another point on that curve of your thumb right there, the widest part of your hand, and then also on the curve of right there on your knuckle of the knuckle of the pinky, which is the other widest part of your hand, and then place a point right there on your wrist bone, right where your wrist bone is. Place a point on where your wrist bone is. On the picture you can't really see the wrist bone, but pay attention to your hand and place a point where your wrist bone is. Once your points have been placed on the pattern paper, you can remove your hand. Alright, so what I want you to do is the point that you made by your wrist and the point that you made at the tip of your finger, I want you to draw 2 horizontal guidelines intersecting that point, going straight across through that point. And then for the 2 points from your knuckles, from the knuckle of your pinky and the knuckle of your thumb, I want you to draw a vertical guideline going through those 2 points. Alright, so as you can see here, after creating the horizontal and vertical guidelines through each point, we've created a rectangle. So what I did was I went ahead and labeled each point so it could be easier for me to give instructions from here on which point to work with. So for the next steps, what we're going to do is create a little bit of ease and seam allowance for our pocket before we start forming our curves to create our pocket. So from from point B, well, let's start at point A. So from point A, I want you to go up 1/4 of an inch from point A. All right, and what we're gonna do is draw a line. We're gonna pretty much move this line here to that point, that new point that we just created. So make sure that you're creating your pattern in pencil so you'll be able to erase when you need to. So because I find it easier to make sure you don't have too many lines on your pattern when you're working with your pattern, so you can stay focused and clear of instructions of what you're actually doing. So I created a new line from that point going up 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same thing with point B down here. I'm going to go down 1/4 of an inch from point B, and I'm going to create a new line and erase this old one. All right, so from point C and point D, we're going to add a little bit more ease. Pretty much with point A and point B, we just added seam allowance, and that's just enough pretty much to get our hand in there, but not to get not go too deep or whatever. So it all depends on how deep you want your pockets to be, on how much you adjust your point A, since that's where your fingers are or whatever. But with your point B, you pretty much want to try and keep your point B as just seam allowance, because that is the part of the pocket that will be connecting to the skirt. And you can adjust your point A to however long you want it to be, depending on how deep you want your pockets. Now for this particular skirt, I don't want the pocket to be too deep or too big, because I don't like bulky pockets, and that's just my preference. So I just added a little bit more seam allowance, and plus it's for my daughter, so I'm pretty sure she won't really be using the pockets like that. But for the sake of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how to put pockets in the skirt. So like I said, if you want to make your pockets a little bit deeper, then go ahead and adjust your A to however high you want it to go. So if you want it to be a little bit deeper, instead of going up just 1/4 of an inch as far as just for seam allowance, then you can go up maybe an inch to give you a little bit more room to go a little bit deeper and add that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just make sure you however much you want, however deep you want it to go, make sure you don't forget about your seam allowance. Now for C and D, it's all about the width and how much room you want your fingers to spread in that pocket. So like I said, this is for my daughter, so I'm not really gonna put too much ease in it, but the C and D will definitely have much more ease than A and B, because I definitely want her to be able to fit her hand in it comfortably and just let her hand sit in it comfortably or whatever. So I'm going to add, and this is including my seam allowance, I'm going to add 1 inch to both C and D. I'm going to go over to the left. I'm going to go over to the left from point C and go over to the right from point D 1 inch and create 2 new lines from point C and D, and that's going to give a little bit room for finger spreading or whatever. Just pretty much give it room for pocket. So alright, so now we have our new rectangle, and as you can see, I cleared off my old lines, and now I'm going to be working with my new lines here. Alright, so from point C and point D, although I have cleared off my lines, what I want to do is draw a line to my wrist line here. This is what I consider my wrist line, because this is where my wrist point is. So I'm going to draw a line from point C to my wrist line and draw a line from point D to my wrist line. So from my new points that I created on my wrist line, I'm going to go over to the left 0.5 inches. And I'm going to go over to the right 0.5 inches. Alright, and the reason why I went over is because 1/4 of an inch is going to be a seam allowance, and then I still wanted to have a little bit of room for a little bit of ease when my hand is entering the pocket. So I want to make sure that the widest part of my hand will fit comfortably inside of the pocket without struggling trying to squeeze it into the pocket, because we know that the wrist is much smaller than the widest part of your hand. So you don't want to keep your wrist the same width of your wrist as far as the opening of the pocket. You want to make sure that the width of the opening of the pocket will fit the widest part of your hand, because your hand must go inside of the pocket. So that's why I use point C and D to create the opening guideline, the opening guide points of the pocket. But then I gave myself a little bit of ease and then seam allowance, so when I sew the pocket on, it will fit perfectly snug, and it won't be too wide, but it won't be too tight to where my hand cannot fit. All right, so I've created 2 new points there because this is going to be pretty much the width and the guide points for creating our curve for our pocket. So those are our points there. And now what I want to do is go ahead and start creating a curve from our new point here, because remember we went up 1/4 of an inch from point A to create a little ease or a seam allowance for when we're sewing. So we went up 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to create a curve going from that point to this vertical guideline here, and then I'm going to create a curve going from the new C point that we created with the ease and the seam allowance to our new point here. And I'm going to show you this here in a minute. Alright, so here is the curve that I created. As you can see, it is now forming a pocket. I pretty much just curved it to meet the 2 outer points here. And from that point as well, I went to point A and curved it to meet that vertical guideline. So you want to make sure you use this vertical guideline here as the guide when creating your curves to each point, to that point A, that new point A. That's 1/4 of an inch from the original point A, and then this new point here, these 2 new outer points on the wrist line here. You want to make sure that you're using that vertical guideline to create. Alright, so as you can see here, I connected those 2 points on the wrist line to create pretty much my opening for my pocket. And then what I did was I found the center of that opening. And that is pretty much our pockets. All you have to do is just cut out around the curve, the wrist line here, all the way around, and then you'll have your pocket. Alright, so here's your finished pocket. Now we're going to take our pocket and go ahead and finish making our pocket guide points on our circle skirt. Alright, so here is our circle skirt and here is our pocket. And remember the line we created from our waist to hip line, and then we found the center of that line. So what I want you to do now is take, and we also found the center of that wrist line on the pocket. So what I want you to do is just take your pocket. What I want you to do is line the center point of that wrist line on your pocket to the center point of that line that you marked on your skirt. Line that up. Alright, as you see there. And what I want you to do is on your skirt, make a point, make a mark at the end of your wrist line here. Pretty much the end of that pocket point. Make a mark there. Alright, so as you can see, I've made my points there. And these will be your guide points here. You'll pretty much make notches in your fabric, so these can be your guide points on where to place your pockets. Alright, so now for the waistband, we're going to be taking our hip measurement for our waistband, and we're going to add a 1/4 inch seam, or whatever your seam allowance, if you want 5/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, whatever your seam allowance is. I'm going to be doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance because this is for my baby girl. So yeah, the seam allowance, I don't want it to be too big. So you're going to take your hip measurement, going to add your seam allowance. I'm going to be doing a 1/4 inch seam, and then you're going to pretty much make a line, a horizontal line of whatever that measurement is. Now if you want to make it easier to cut, you could divide that hip number in half and then add your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that will pretty much, you can pretty much just put the fabric on fold and cut it that way. But I do believe that that will make it easier. So this right here is my full hip length. So what I'm going to do is create another one with half the hip length plus 1/4 of an inch. Alright, so this is half my hip length here, And what I'll do is I'll mark my center, and I'll make sure that I mark on fold, cut on fold, when creating my pattern, so I will know when it's time to cut that this is a waistband. This is just half of the portion of the waistband, and I need to cut this fabric or cut it on fold. So I'm going to be working with this one here, not the full length one. I'm going to be working with the half length one. Alright, so because I'm using 1-inch elastic, I'm going to make my waistband 2.5 inches long. So I'm going to go down from that point, 2.5 inches. Alright, so let me go ahead and explain how you calculate your waistband. Now for the width of your waistband, you want to take your hip measurement, divide that by 2, and then add your seam allowance, because we're creating the pattern to where you cut it on fold, to where it would be much easier to just cut it. And for the length of your waistband, you want to calculate it based off the width of your elastic, pretty much the width of elastic of your choice. So whatever the width of your elastic is, you want to multiply that by 2, and then you want to add whatever the seam allowance that you're using, multiply that seam allowance by 2, and you want to add that to the width of the calculation for the width of your elastic. So I'm going to go ahead and show you an example by showing you what I'm doing here. So I'm mainly going to just focus on the the length of the waistband. So alright, so now you can understand why I will be doing 2.5 inches in length for my waistband for my daughter here, is because I took the width of my elastic, which is 1 inch, and I multiplied that by 2, and I added that to the quarter inch seam allowance that I will be using. I multiplied that by 2, and the reason why I did that is because I'm creating pretty much a whole length, but I will be folding that waistband in half when sewing it onto my skirt. So when you fold something in half, it creates 2. So you want to make sure that you want to multiply the width of the elastic, multiply the width times 2, as well as the seam allowance, because you will have 2 sides once it's folded in half. And I hope that was not confusing, but I really wanted to break that down to help you understand. And once I actually get to sewing, you will understand even more why I created it this way, versus because I don't want to do like 2 pieces and sew 2 pieces together and then I wanted to fold the waistband in half. So that's why I created the length of the waistband the way I did. So this is the completed waistband. So my horizontal guideline, or my horizontal line, the horizontal width of the waistband is my hip divided by 2 plus my seam allowance. And then the vertical length of my waistband is pretty much the length of my elastic, or the width of my elastic, or whatever. And it's pretty much 2.5 inches. 2.5 inches. And what I'm going to do is mark one side of my waistband, the center, and make sure that I put cut on fold, because this one, the center will be cut on fold. Now the center will be your vertical line, not your horizontal, because you pretty much already have a center here, because that's going to be folded in half. So I'm going to create a fold line here in the center, and then I'm going to mark my center of the waistband to where when I'm getting ready to cut it out, I will know where to put the fold, the pattern on the fold of the fabric. Alright, so as you can see here, I've labeled my waistband, and I've labeled my center, I've created my fold line, and I've labeled the instructions on how to cut it. Alright, so these are the 3 pattern pieces that we'll be using for our circle skirt with elastic waistband and with pockets. So this is the end of the pattern tutorial. Be sure to go check out my sewing tutorial, where I will be showing you how to actually construct the skirt using these 3 patterns.